In this lesson, we'll learn how we can connect in texture maps as part of our materials. Okay, so in our previous lesson, we talked about some of the basics of just making a simple material and assigning that to our objects. So in this lesson, let's start to get a little bit more complicated, and we'll learn how we can start to include things like texture maps in as part of our materials. So what I'll do is go ahead and start with opening my material manager. So I'll press Ctrl+7 on my keyboard to open this up. And I'll start by just making myself a new material. So we'll go to Create, and I'll use something like a Fong. Again, just kind of a nice metallic type material. So with this Fong selected, if I were to double click on this, we can actually open up the property page so we can actually access things like the color, the ambience, the specularity, and so on and so forth. So what I want to do is actually connect a map into the color. So right next to this color, if we follow this connection over, you can see this little port, or this little plug icon. Now if I click on this, we should be able to come in, and we can essentially now choose what we want to plug into this. In my case, I'm going to plug in an image. So you can see here's the image that comes up. Now we're going to go to New, and New from File. Now the first place that Softimage is going to look for a picture is inside the Pictures directory of the project that you're working out of. Now if you take a look inside my Pictures directory, we have two basic texture maps, one for Ship Color and one for Ship Bump. So I'm going to start with Ship Color. Go ahead and press OK. And now here is our color map. And if you look closely, we can actually see what this looks like here within the actual render tree. So essentially you can think of this as just a node-based version of what we have. We have our basic material. Plugged into that, we have some kind of an image node or some kind of an image texture. And then finally we have the actual texture that is plugged in and driving all of that. Now, as we'll see here in just a moment, there are actually several things we're going to have to do in order to get this to working properly. So let's start by just taking the actual material. Let's drag it right onto a part of our object. In this case, we'll just do the fuselage. Now, if we close this, we should be able to switch this to some kind of a textured or a textured decal. So if we switch it to textured, we should be able to see any texturing with any shadows and shading included, which at the moment you'll notice that even though we have the material that's assigned to this object and we do have texturing enabled, you'll notice that there are no textures that show up. And that's because of a very, very important thing called UVs. Now UVs you can really think of as just the overall information that tells a texture how it's supposed to wrap around and be applied to an object. Now any object that we create inside of Softimage by default has no UVs, which means that object has no idea how any textures are supposed to wrap around it. So as a result, anytime we drop a texture onto an object, nothing will show up. So what we'll have to do is with all objects that have a texture, we need to make sure that we give it some kind of UV information. So to do this, let's start by just selecting the fuselage. Let's go to Get Property, Texture Projection. And in this case, because we are using a surface or a NURBS object, we can do just a simple UV projection. So as soon as I click on this, you can see here is our UV structure on this. And now, all of a sudden, we can see the texture. Because now Softimage knows how that texture is supposed to be wrapped around our object. So if we go back to our material manager, again, Ctrl+7, select our Fong material, and we'll probably go ahead and rename this, so we can call this something like airplane body. There we are. So let's actually start to make some adjustments to the way that this texture looks. So I'll try to move this over and give myself a little bit more room to work. Let's start by actually double-clicking on the image itself. So let's double-click on this. If we go over to Advanced, this is where we can actually control the number of texture repeats and things like that. So right now it's just one simple texture that's being mapped around our object. But what we could do is set our number of repeats to, let's say, 2 by 2 by 2. And now it's actually going to repeat that texture twice. So this might be a little bit easier to see if I were to switch this from a textured to a textured decal. When we set that to a textured decal, now we should be able to see the effect of our texture without any interference from our shading or shadowing. So now we can actually see what this looks like. Very nice. So really the concept of UVs and how those relate to your textures can sometimes be kind of a tricky process or a tricky concept to grasp. So we're not really going to go too extraordinarily deep into the subject of UVs, but if you would like to know more about these, we actually do discuss these in much greater detail in an entirely separate course. So we actually have an entire course dedicated to the process, and this is titled UV Layout in Softimage. So if you would like to learn more about texturing in Softimage, then I would highly recommend viewing that course once you've had a chance to finish with this one. So for now, that's a look at some of the basic processes and steps of actually taking our textures and assigning those to our objects. Now in our next lesson, we're going to look at some additional methods for texturing some of these other surfaces of this aircraft.